Welcome to How to Become a Production SQL Database Administrator. My name is Raphael. In the previous video, we looked at the backup strategy that a production database must employ and deploy for a company. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate to you what is a full database backup and how to take a full database backup using the GUI and then taking a full database backup using T-SQL. So let's begin. As you'll notice in the Object Explorer here, I have a database called AdventureWorks 2012. If I expand it, you'll see that it has other various objects, such as tables, and these are all the tables associated with this database. We also have all these views associated with the database, and if I expand the programmability folder, and then this, you'll see the various store procedures that are related to this database. And then if I expand security and users, these are all users for this database. So my point here is that when we do a backup of a database, it's not necessarily backing up just the tables and the data, but it's talking about the entire schema within this database. So it's important to know that distinction, that when we make a copy and when we take a full database backup, it's taking a backup of this entire schema set here, not just the tables. So that's important. So now let's begin and take a backup. So if we want to take a full database backup of AdventureWorks 2012 using the GUI, we select the database, go right click, go to task, and then obviously select the option backup. This window will pop up. You obviously have these options here. Obviously we're taking a full database backup, so it'll be illustrated here. Obviously we're talking about the AdventureWorks. The recovery model by default is set to simple for this database. That means that we cannot take transactional log backups, by the way, and we've discussed recovery models earlier. Obviously you have the option on the backup set to either keep the backup for a certain time period or it will expire after allocated days if you want to choose that. And then the other two options you will have here is the destination. As you can see, by default, it's selected disk. And this is the path that the database backup will be placed. As you'll notice, it's defaulted to drive C. And as I've mentioned earlier, that this is not wise, that the backups should have their own drives away from the default C. So you should have a drive D or E or something, and certainly not on the drive where your transactional logs or your data files are. There should be a separate file, a separate drive. And then there, you should be able to take backups of that on a separate server in a remote site for redundancies. So this is a very important option to understand. If you wanted to change this option here, you go Add, click here, and then obviously you can navigate to the drive where you want to do it. So if I wanted to drive it here, I can select this, call it AdventureWorks full database backup, and go OK. But for our demonstration purposes, we're just going to leave it on drive C. But remember, in a production environment, you never have it on drive C or on your data logs or your transactional log drives. Always have it on a separate, and then take a copy and put it somewhere else also. So we won't have redundancies. Let's look at some of the options that we have here. You can overwrite the media. And this basically says that when you take a database backup, it will append to the existing backup sets. So if you already had a backup of AdventureWorks 2012, it will just add to it and not overwrite it. If you want to overwrite it, then you select this option. But be careful, if you select this, then all the files will be overwritten. So let's just leave it to appending. You should check Verify when finished. And this basically says that the media set is valid, that the backup itself is valid. It does not talk about the data within it. So we will be talking about the validity of the data itself, but this is just to verify that the backup is valid. We can also perform a checksum, and this just looks at either torn pages, but I'll be discussing that in a little later. You have the option, obviously, of compressing the data, which means that you'll have a smaller size backup if you wish that, and obviously it's a great advantage because the restore will be quicker because your size of your database has been drastically reduced. One thing to note is if you're using compression primarily on large databases, that it takes a tremendous amount of CPU usage. So it'll take somewhere around 75-80% when you're restoring it and compressing it. So be careful in using that in a production environment. Again, you should not be using this in a production environment or executing a backup in a production environment. The time I mentioned about when you should take backups. Always take full differential backups during off hours if possible. Taking a backup is a resource-intense process, so that we highly recommend that you take a full database backup off hours. I think I mentioned that earlier. So now this is how you take a full database backup. So if I go OK, you can see the progress here. Since it's very quick, it'll just take a few seconds, and you'll get a window saying backup database recovered successfully. If I go OK, we've recovered it. If I wanted to see that backup, there it is, right there. And later on, we'll be illustrating how to look inside this file to verify that the database backup has indeed been accomplished. But that was very simple of how to take a full database backup. Let me delete this and go back here. So that's a simple, easy way of doing it. So now that we've gone over how to take a full database backup using the GUI, how do you do it using T-SQL? That's very easy also. The first thing I'm going to do is create a database called Backup Database. So I'm going to highlight this, execute, go to Databases, refresh, and there's the database. And again, if I expand the table, you'll notice there are no tables there. So the next thing I'm going to do is create a table. I'm going to insert 6 records. I'm going to view that table just to verify that we have 6 records. And now what I'm going to do is take a full database backup using T-SQL. The command is backup database, followed by the database name. To disk, this is the path we want the database backup to reside. No int, with no int means that it will not be overwritten. Obviously, we're giving it the name. We're talking about whether it needs to be compression or not, and whether we're talking about statistics to be updated every 10 seconds. So once I highlight this and execute, it'll just take a second or so to do the full database backup. So what does that mean when I've taken a full database backup? In this particular case, as I mentioned, that this table with 6 entries, now we have a copy of this products table. If the database were to crash, or I were to delete this database, I can restore it. I can restore all the data up to this many rows in that table. But what happens if I were to add another row, for example? Let's change this to motor. Let's change this to Chevy and insert another record. So now what I'm doing is I'm inserting another record into that table. And if I look at the products table, I've got now 7 records. But one thing, the reason I'm pointing that is that the full database backup that I just took here has only the backup copy of this many, the first 6 rows. So if the database were to crash now and I were to restore it, I would not get this last entry. So that's important to understand. The full database backup makes a copy of the full database at the time you take it. At that time, we only had 6 entries. Anything after that, if we don't do another full backup or transactional log backups, that data will be lost. So that's the important distinction to understand. One thing I also wanted to discuss is the verification of that backup. And this is the file. If I just highlight this, now don't worry about the syntax here. It's not something you have to memorize. I'll be providing it for you. But this verifies that the database backup is valid, not the data within. So if I execute this, it just says the backup set is valid. And that's all we're wanting to know. If we see that comment, then we know that the backup set is valid, not the data within. That's another DBCC that I will illustrate to you. And one thing I wanted to point out is, well, actually, I'm going to leave it there. You can look at the inside of the database by using this command from the backup file using the MSD database. So I'll provide this for you. And again, don't worry about memorizing it. Just highlight this, execute, and now you'll see all the database backups that I did are all recorded here. So you got the logical name, remember the backup databases I did, the file names, the file type, the location, and so on. And obviously you can see this is a full database backup, this is log backup, and these are the positions, the file numbers. And obviously this is a history of all the database backup that we did, and I'll be talking about that also. So now you understand what the importance of a full database backup is, how you can take a backup taking the GUI, and how you can take a full database backup using the transactional T-SQL. So I'm going to leave it there and continue next with the transactional log backup video in the next video. So I'll leave it there. My name is Rafael, and this is how to become a production SQL database administrator.